Hello St Nicholas class and welcome to our last video. How did you get on with Tuesday's task and looking back to the start of year 3? Hopefully it showed you just how much you've grown up in year 3 and how far you've come, and maybe things you found a bit scary at the start of year 3 aren't so scary anymore. So today we're going to read a little bit more Roald Dahl Boy and then I'm going to set you your final task. Okay, so sit back, get comfy. This next chapter is called The Matron. At St Peter's, the ground floor was all classrooms. The first floor was all dormitories. On the dormitory floor, the matron ruled supreme. This was her territory. Hers was the only voice of authority up here. And even the 11 and 12-year-old boys were terrified of this female ogre, for she ruled with a rod of steel. The matron was a large, fair-haired woman. Her age was probably no more than 28, but it made no difference whether she was 28 or 68, because to us, a grown-up was a grown-up, and all grown-ups were dangerous creatures at this school. Once you had climbed to the top of the stairs and set foot on the dormitory floor, you were in the matron's power. And the source of this power was the unseen but frightening figure of the headmaster, lurking down in the depths of the study below. At any time she liked, the matron could send you down in your pyjamas and dressing gown to report to this merciless giant, and whenever this happened, you got caned on the spot. The matron knew this, and she relished the whole business. She could move along the corridor like lightning, and when you least expected it, her head would come popping through the dormitory doorway. "Who threw that sponge?" said the dreaded voice. "It was you, Perkins, was it not? Don't lie to me, Perkins. Don't argue with me. I know perfectly well it was you. Now you can put your dressing gown on and go downstairs and report to the headmaster this instant." In slow motion and with immense reluctance, little Perkins, aged 8.5, would get into his dressing gown and slippers and disappear down the long corridor that led to the back stairs and the headmaster's private quarters. And the matron, as we all knew, would follow him after him and stand at the top of the stairs listening with a funny look on her face for the crack, crack, crack of the cane that would soon be coming from below. To me, the noise always sounded as though the headmaster was firing a pistol at the ceiling in his study. Looking back on it now, there seems little doubt that matron disliked small boys very much indeed. She never smiled at us or said anything nice, and when, for example, the lint stuck to the cut on your kneecap, you were not allowed to take it off yourself, bit by bit, so that it didn't hurt. She would always whip it off with a flourish, muttering, "Don't be such a ridiculous little boy." On one occasion, during my first term, I went down to the matron's room to have some iodine put on my Gray's knee. I didn't know you had to knock before you entered. I opened the door and walked right in, and there she was in the centre of the sick room floor, locked in some kind of embrace with the Latin master, Mr. Victor Corrado. They fell apart as I entered, and both their faces went suddenly crimson. "How dare you come in without knocking?" the matron shouted. "Here I am, trying to get something out of Mr. Corrado's eye, and here you burst in and disturb the whole delicate operation." "I'm very sorry, matron." "Go away and come back in 5 minutes," she cried, and I shot out of the room like a bullet. After lights out, the matron would prowl the corridor like a panther, trying to catch the sound of whisper behind a dormitory door, and we soon learnt that her powers of hearing were so phenomenal that it was safer just to keep quiet. Once, after lights out, a brave boy called Rag tiptoed out of the dormitory and sprinkled caster sugar all over the floor of the corridor. When Rag returned and told us that the corridor had been successfully sugared from one end to the other, I began shivering with excitement. I lay there in the dark in my bed, waiting and waiting for matron to go on the prowl. Nothing happened. Perhaps I told myself she's in the room, taking another speck of dust out of Mr. Victor Corrado's eye. Suddenly, from far down the corridor, came the resounding crunch, 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 went the footsteps. It sounded as though a giant was walking on loose gravel. Then we heard the high-pitched, furious voice of the matron in the distance. "Who did this?" she was shrieking. "How dare you do this?" She was crunching along the corridor, flinging open all the dormitory doors and switching on all the lights. The insensitivity of her fury was frightening. "Come along," she cried out, marching with crunching steps up and down the corridor. "Own up, I want the name of the filthy little boy who put down the sugar. Own up immediately, step forward, confess." "Don't own up," we whispered to Rag. "We won't give you away." Rag kept quiet. I didn't blame him for that. If he had owned up, it was certain fate. He would have had he'd have been a terrible and bloody one. Soon the headmaster was summoned from below. The matron, with steam coming out of her nostrils, cried out to him for help, and now the whole school was herded into the long corridor, where we stood freezing in our pyjamas and bare feet, while the culprit of culprits were ordered to step forward. Nobody stepped forward. I could see that the headmaster was getting very angry indeed. His evening had been interrupted. Red splotches were appearing all over his face, and flecks of spit were shooting out of his mouth as he talked. "Very well," he thundered. "Every one of you will go at once and get the key of your tuck box and hand the keys to matron, who will keep them for the rest of the term, and all parcels coming from home will be confiscated from now on. I will not tolerate this kind of behaviour." We handed in our keys, and throughout the remaining 6 weeks of term we went very hungry. But all through those 6 weeks, Arkle continued to feed his frog with slugs through the hole in the lid of his tuck box. Using an old teapot, he also poured water in through the hole every day to keep the creature moist and happy. I admired Arkle very much for looking after his frog so well. Although he himself was famished, he refused to let his frog go hungry. Ever since then, I have tried to be kind to small animals. Each dormitory had about 20 beds in it. These were smallish, narrow beds ranged along the walls on either side. Down the centre of the dormitory stood the basins where you washed your hands and face and did your teeth, always with cold water, which stood in a large jug on the floor. Once you had entered the dormitory, you were not allowed to leave, unless you were reporting to matron's room with some sickness or injury. Under each bed there was a white chamber pot, and before getting into bed you were expected to kneel on the floor and empty your bladder into it. All around the dormitory, just before lights out were heard, and the tinkle-tinkle of little boys peeing into their pots. Once you'd done this and got into bed, you were not allowed to get out of it again until the next morning. There was, I believe, a lavatory somewhere along the corridor, but only an attack of acute diarrhoea would be expected as an excuse for visiting it. A journey to the upstairs lavatory automatically cast you as a diarrhoea victim, and a dose of thick white liquid would immediately be forced down your throat by the matron. This made you constipated for weeks. The first miserable homesick night at St. Peter's, when I curled up in bed and the lights were put out, I could think of nothing but our house at home and my mother and my sisters. Where were they? I asked myself. In which direction from here? I was lying was Llandaff. I began to work it out, and it wasn't difficult to do this because I had the Bristol Channel to help me. If I'd looked out of the dormitory window, I could see the Channel itself and the big city of Cardiff, and the Llandaff alongside it lay almost directly across the water, but slightly to the north. Therefore, if I turned towards the window, I'd be facing home. I wriggled round in my bed and faced my home and my family. From then on, during all the time I was at St. Peter's, I never went to sleep with my back to my family. Different beds and different dormitories required the working out of new directions, but the Bristol Channel was always my guide, and I was always able to draw an imaginary line from my bed to our house over in Wales. Never once did I go to sleep looking away from my family. It was a great comfort. There was a boy in our dormitory, during my first term called Tweedy, who one night started snoring soon after he had gone to sleep. "What's that talking?" cried the matron, bursting in. My own bed was close to the door, and I remembered looking up at her from my pillow and seeing her standing there, her silhouette against the light from the corridor, and thinking how truly frightening she looked. I think it was her enormous bosom that scared me most of all. My eyes were riveted to it, and to me it was like a battering ram of the bows in the icebreaker. It may be a couple of high explosive bombs. "Own up," she cried. "Who was talking?" We lay there in silence. Then Tweedy, who was lying fast asleep on his back with his mouth open, gave another snore. The matron stared at Tweedy. "Snoring is a disgusting habit," she said. "Only the lower classes do it. We shall have to teach him a lesson." She didn't switch on the light, but she advanced into the room and picked up a cake of soap and the nearest basin. The bare electric bulb in the corridor illuminated the whole dormitory in a pale, creamy glow. None of us dared to sit up in bed, but all eyes were on the matron now, watching to see what she was going to do next. She always had a pair of scissors hanging by white tape from her waist, and with this she began shaving thin slithers of soap into the palm of one hand. Then she went over to where the wretched Tweedy lay, and very carefully she dropped these little soap flakes into his mouth. She had a whole handful of them, and I thought she was never going to stop. What on earth was she doing? What was going to happen? I wondered. Would Tweedy choke? Would he strangle? Might his throat get blocked up completely? Was she going to kill him? The matron stepped back a couple of paces and folded her arms across, or rather underneath her massive chest. Nothing happened. Tweedy kept right on snoring. Then suddenly he began to gargle, and white bubbles appeared around his lips. The bubbles grew and grew until, in the end, his whole face seemed to be smothered in a bubbly, foaming, white soapy froth. It was a horrific sight. Then all at once Tweedy gave a great cough and a splutter, and he sat up very fast and began clawing at his face with his hands. "Oh," he stuttered. Oh, why? What's happening? What's this on my face? Someone help me." The matron threw him a face flannel and said, "Wipe it off, Tweedy, and don't ever let me hear you snoring again. Hasn't anyone ever taught you not to go to sleep on your back?" With that, she marched out of the dormitory and slammed the door. Okay, so that's as much as we can read together of Roald Dahl Boy. But we do have these in school, so when we're back, if you wanted to find out what happens in the rest, you can borrow it and read the rest of the story. So, for our final task, what I thought we'd do is we'd try and put together different things we've done this term. So, we've looked at graffiti artists, we've looked at urban spaces, we've looked at what it'd be like to grow up many years ago, and what it would be like to be your age many years ago and growing up in Horsham. So, what I want us to think about is go back to thinking about graffiti. So, we had the argument whether graffiti was art, whether it was vandalism, and we looked at Banksy, who uses his graffiti to voice his opinion and send messages. Okay, so we looked at some of these images together and discussed what we thought they meant and the messages Banksy was sending. And this is one of his most recent ones about the NHS. And some of you may have seen, or if you ask your adult at home, they may have seen in the news that Banksy recently has managed to get on an underground tube train, and he's created some new graffiti on there. So if you haven't seen it already, ask someone if they can show you, because that's his latest stuff and there's a very clear message. We looked at the Berlin Wall, why it was put up, why it came down, why it was so important, and we looked at all the graffiti that covered it, and most of the time it was graffiti of messages of hope and wanting to be reconnected with other people. We had graffiti such as this, where it showed the faces trying to get through the wall. Sorry, my screen's a little bit stuck at the moment. So, what your task is going to be is you have been practicing becoming graffiti artists. You have tried some Banksy stencils. You have created messages you would like to send. You've created pieces of graffiti you could put on walls that maybe send a positive message or a message of love to people. So what I would like you to do is, and this is another image of a mural or graffiti on the side of a building that very much represents how we are now. There's Captain Tom, thank you our NHS, and someone's put that on the side of a house. So what I'd like you to do is I would like you to create your own piece of graffiti. So you can use the stencils that Banksy uses and create it like that. You can draw it freehand, which means you just draw it without anything helping you. But I'd like you to create a piece of graffiti for St. John's School. So it can be a piece of graffiti that sends a message, maybe a message of hope out to all the other children at school. You may want to send a graffiti out with our message, learn to love and love to learn. So think about if you could create a huge piece of graffiti on the wall of St. John's, what would you want it to be? Would you want it to send a message to all the other children at school? Would you want it to send a message out to the community? Would you want it to be a picture of something or a picture of children? Have a think what you'd like your piece of graffiti to mean. And then I'd like you to design some graffiti for St. John's School. So have fun, get creative. If you'd like to send me what you've done, I'd love to see it. So you can send it to stava@stjohnshorsham.school, or you can send it to your class email, because I know Miss Putnam loves to see what you've been up to. Have fun and have a lovely summer. Bye, St. Nicholas class.